All right. All right. We're looking at Caligula. Caligula was very popular at the beginning of his reign, but he began to show signs of mental weakness. In fact, he was only what could be called crazy. He came to believe that he was the incarnation of Zeus and demanded that he be worshiped as a god. Well, this, of course, alienated the Jews. He did all kinds of crazy things, such as commanding his army to attack the sea to conquer Neptune, the god of the sea. Now, can you imagine sending his soldiers to attack the sea? He made his racehorse a member of the Senate. Caligula demanded that his statue be erected in the temple in Jerusalem. Now, the Roman legate in Jerusalem postponed it very wisely, and Caligula died so that a crisis was averted. Okay, Claudius ruled from AD 41 to 54. He was Caligula's uncle and was made emperor when Caligula died. He had suffered from a childhood illness, and so it left him weak. Physically, he didn't look good, but he was a scholar and a good ruler. He turned the Roman Empire into a bureaucracy run by committees and secretaries. He determined to restore the ancient Roman religion. The historian Suetonius says that he expelled the Jews from Rome because of some riots that had taken place at the instigation of a man by the name of Chrestus. Now, it could be that Suetonius was confused and that he should have said Christus. In the first century, those two names would have been pronounced the same. Christus is the Latin version of Christ. And it could be that the Jews were rioting against the Christians, and that to stop the riots, he just said to all of them, leave town, get out. And of course, most of the church there would have been Jews. So the Christians had to leave as well, the Jewish Christians. And that changed the character of the church. It left only the Gentiles there in the church. Claudius was the emperor during most of Paul's ministry. So this great time of expansion of the church was done when Claudius was the emperor. It appears that his wife Agrippina, who was also his niece, poisoned him so that her 16-year-old son could become the emperor by the name of Nero. Now, Nero ruled from 54 to 68. So when Claudius died, Nero inherited the throne. Agrippina attempted to wield the power there, and in AD 59, Nero had her murdered. The first 5 years of Nero's reign were peaceful and successful. He was coached by his mother and by the philosopher Seneca. And we're gonna hear about Seneca a little later. We're gonna hear about his brother a little bit later. But Nero had his mother murdered, and he had Seneca exiled. His extravagance depleted the treasury, and he tried to replenish it with oppression and violence. In AD 64, a fire broke out in Rome, a tremendous fire that destroyed much of the central section of Rome. Nero was suspected of deliberately setting it to make room for his new home called the Golden House, which was to cover 125 acres or 51 hectares. That's a pretty big house. Now, in order to divert the blame for the fire from himself, he accused the Christians of setting it. Many Christians were arrested and tortured. This was the first persecution of the church by the Roman state. Tradition tells us that both Peter and Paul were executed during this time of persecution. The people of Rome finally revolted against Nero. In fact, the persecution against the Christians was so great that people started sympathizing with the Christians. They revolted against Nero. Nero fled Rome and died at the hand of one of his companions at his request, rather than be captured. He was followed by Galba in 68, Otho in 69, and Vitellius also in 69. Within the span of a year, they had 3 Roman emperors. Galba was murdered. Otho was killed in battle. Vitellius only lasted for a short time. He was attacked by the forces of the Roman general Vespasian and was killed. So that brings us then to the next emperor, Vespasian. Vespasian was declared ruler on the death of Vitellius. Do you recognize this name Vespasian from somewhere else? He is the Roman general that came against Jerusalem. Okay, when the Jews revolted, the general Vespasian came against Jerusalem. He was an old soldier. He was frugal. He consolidated the Roman Empire. Now, his son Titus, who was also a Roman general, completed what he started in Jerusalem. So Titus took over the siege of Jerusalem and then destroyed the temple and the city. Vespasian built the famous Roman Colosseum in AD 79. And by the way, I just saw in the news that for the first time, they have restored the underground part of the Colosseum. So you can go and see where the gladiators and the wild beasts waited before they went on the field there to do their thing. And then we come to Titus. When Vespasian died, his son Titus became emperor. Although his reign was short, he was one of the most popular rulers that Rome ever had. It is speculated that Domitian, his brother, had him murdered. So he was followed then by Domitian. When Titus died in 81, the Senate conferred upon Domitian the rulership of the Roman Empire. Now, in many ways, Domitian was a good and strong ruler, but he insisted on being worshiped as Lord and God. In 93 AD, he executed some Christians for refusing to offer sacrifices before his image. And tradition tells us that his own nephew, Flavius Clemens, was part of that group that he had executed. many scholars believe that it was against the background of Domitian's rule that the book of Revelation was written. Now, Domitian has a reputation for being a great persecutor of the church. Lately, that position has come under attack, under fire, because some say that there's really no evidence that he was a persecutor. So I guess we'll have to let the historians fight that one off. In his later years, he became suspicious of those around him. The Senate and his family were on pins and needles, wondering if they were going to be the next ones to be accused of wanting to unseat him as emperor. Finally, his family arranged to have him assassinated in AD 96. So Domitian is the last emperor that we're going to consider here in our brief overview of the emperors during New Testament times. In reviewing the Roman environment of the New Testament, we see that Jesus was born when Augustus was the Roman emperor. Jesus ministered and died when Tiberius was the Roman emperor. The great time of church expansion came under Claudius and Nero. And the Apocalypse, the book of Revelation, was probably written against the backdrop of Domitian's reign. Okay, do you have questions or comments here?
Sir,
Yes.
sir, I would like to ask about the paranoid. It's like prevalent to those leaders that time. This is actually the mental health, concerning mental health issue.
I think so. I think it's a mental health issue. There are people today who have paranoia. They aren't rulers, they're just ordinary people. But it seems to be especially bad with the rulers. I mean, think of all the rulers that we've talked about here in the last couple of days that have had this fear of somebody's going to overthrow me. Like one person said, if everybody was after you, you'd be paranoid too. Well, yeah, maybe so.
And then, sir, to the extent that they kill their loved ones without any fear.
I'm sorry, you're breaking up there. Say it again.
Sir, is the up to the point that they able to kill their loved ones or their relatives?
Yes.
Just for power.
Yes.
I'm so overwhelmed. Like it was real. Right?
Yes. Think of all the people the Hasmonean rulers had murdered, members of their own family. Think of Herod and all of those that he had killed, Herod the Great, and then here among the Romans. So it is something that, yeah, maybe today we can say North Korea, you know? It seems like there may be some parallel right there. Any other questions, comments? All right, let us go on. And let's see, we'll stop the share. And then we'll do another share screen. And we will go to Jewish background. All right. Are you getting any screen share?
Mm,
Yes, doctor.
Yes.
Yes, I see your screen.
Okay.
Yes.
but not like before, sir.
Yeah.
All right.
I think
Are you getting the full picture?
not
No,
yes, sir.
not the full picture, sir.
Okay, because I'm getting the full picture on my monitor. All right.
Doctor, I think I can see it. I think this one I can see it clearly, so you don't need to make it bigger.
Okay. Do you have the full screen with the PowerPoint here?
The
Not
picture.
not the full screen, sir.
Only
Yeah.
part, huh? Okay.
Yeah.
Slide on it.
Okay, but it's still just partly there, huh? So you still don't have the full screen?
Yes, doctor.
You do or you don't have the full screen?
I don't see full screen, but
Okay.
I think it's okay for me because I can see your next slide.
Okay. Does it say Jewish Society?
Yes, it says Jewish Society.
Okay. Well, let's try that and see how it looks, and see if that'll work. All right. Okay. Okay. We're going to look at how Jewish society was in terms of stratification, the wealthy, the elite versus those who are poor. Now, in Jewish society, there's less stratification than in pagan society at large. The reason for this was that the Jewish scriptures, or our Old Testament, taught that all people are equal before God. They pleaded for the cause of the defenseless, the orphan, the widow, the alien, and condemned oppression. And that had a leveling influence on society. Nevertheless, there was some stratification. Okay, does your PowerPoint say Jewish aristocracy? Okay. The range of stratification goes all the way from the ruling elite at the top to the destitute at the bottom. The aristocracy was made up of the priesthood and the leading rabbis. The Sanhedrin, which was the highest tribunal or law court of the Jews, was made up of influential members of society. We have here the high priests, the members of the priestly families, elders, that is tribal and family heads, and the scribes or legal experts. The high priest was the president. It was Caiaphas at the time of Jesus' ministry and Ananias at the time of Paul. The family of the high priest and the elders were wealthy. Today, you can see the remains of the houses in which they lived, right to the east of the Temple Mount. After the 1967 war, the Jews got that area and they started doing excavations. And they have excavated the homes where the high priest lived. And they were mansions. They were beautiful homes, mosaic floors, and it was just really quite amazing. The high priest were people of wealth. It's too bad that that didn't go down the line to others. The Pharisees that we read about in the New Testament were from the upper strata of society. They were able to devote themselves much of their time to the keeping of the law, not only the law of the Old Testament, but also the tradition of the elders. They looked down on the ordinary people and called them the people of the land. Now, most of the population in Palestine in New Testament times were farmers, artisans, and small businessmen. Wright and Bird break it down into 7 economic levels, from the ruling elite to the top to the destitute at the bottom. Now, in Palestine, 3 languages were spoken. The native language was Aramaic, and Jesus certainly spoke Aramaic. Hebrew was the language of the synagogue and the temple. The Jewish scriptures were almost totally in Hebrew, and some Israelites spoke it. Jesus could very well have spoken Greek, since Greek was the trade language throughout most of the Roman Empire. Now, in Jewish society, the extended family was very important, as it is in many non-Western societies today. In Western society, the nuclear family, husband, wife, children, are basic. But in many parts of the world, the extended family is. So you have the grandparents, cousins, aunts and uncles, and all of this. And all of that is very important. It was in Jewish society. The father of the extended family determined what the family needed, including its religion. All right, questions or comments so far? If you do, just feel free to speak out. Judaism. Here we need to say a word about our terminology. The history of Israel, that term, refers to Israel before the Babylonian captivity. So in the early days of Israel, we call that history of Israel. Judaism refers to the religion of the Jewish people from the Babylonian captivity until now. Ancient Judaism refers to Judaism from 500 BC to AD 500. So there are 1,000 years. We call that ancient Judaism. Second Temple Judaism goes from 500 BC, the Babylonian captivity, to AD 70, the destruction of the Jewish temple. Some scholars end it at the Bar Kokhba revolt in 135. So there's a little bit of disagreement as to when Second Temple Judaism ends. Rabbinic Judaism goes from AD 70, which was the destruction of the temple, to around AD 500. Medieval Judaism goes from AD 500 to the Reformation or Renaissance. And then modern Judaism goes from the Reformation or Renaissance to the present. So that is our terminology. Judaism from the Babylonian captivity today, and then the breakdown of that terminology all the way to today. Of all the religions in the world, Judaism at the time of Jesus was unique. It was a national religion, and yet even when the Jews had no nation of their own, their religion persisted. Also, people of other ethnic groups and racial groups could join this national religion by becoming proselytes. The temple and its sacrifices played a central role in its religion. And yet, in the absence of the temple, when the temple had been destroyed, the religion persisted. Judaism is monotheistic, not as other religions that worshiped only one God, but with the very denial of the existence of other gods. There are other supernatural beings, but there's no other being like God. There is only one God. Further, Judaism did not make any visual representation of its God. No images, no pictures. The Christian religion sprang from Judaism. Jesus was a Jew. All the apostles were Jews. The Jewish scriptures were the church's scriptures. In its infancy, the church in Jerusalem continued to meet in the temple. Christianity was seen as another sect of Judaism. And it didn't occur to the primitive church in Jerusalem that a person would have to choose between Christianity and Judaism. They simply saw Jesus Christ as the fulfillment of the Old Testament promises. Now, we looked earlier about how the parting of the ways came about. But in those beginning days, Christianity was seen to be completed Judaism. Now they had the Messiah. Now they knew who the Messiah was. To the end of his life, Paul was a confirmed Jew. Not a Jew in the same way as he was before, but his scriptures was the Old Testament. He went to the temple. He made vows, and he continued as a Jew. All right. Let's look at the origin of Judaism. The Jewish nation had its beginning with Abraham, the father of the nation. To Moses, God gave the covenant which regulated the religious and secular lives of the Jewish people. Throughout their history, from the time of Moses to the time of the exile, when Babylon took Jerusalem captive, the Jews vacillated in their commitment to God. By vacillating, we mean went back and forth. They would serve God, and then they would serve the idols, and then God would bring a judge, and he would bring them back to the true worship of God, and then they would go back to their idols. God would bring punishment. They would go back to God, and that's the way it was until the Jewish exile. So a major problem for centuries with the Jews was idolatry. But with the captivity of Judah, the exile, the Jewish religion was transformed, not in its essence, but in its adherence. Never again was idolatry a problem for the Jews. The Jews had to decide once and for all they were going to serve. Either commit themselves wholly to the worship of the one true God, or be absorbed into the surrounding nations to which they had been deported and fled, and lose their existence as a people who worship the one true God. Well, they chose the former. And this small national religion that depended so much on the temple and placed such a great emphasis on the land has continued now for more than 2,500 years without the temple, and for most of that time without the land. It's just amazing. I had a college professor when I went to a community college here in the US. He was an atheist. And I think his goal in his class was to convert his entire class to atheism. But he said there was one thing that he couldn't understand, and that was the Jewish people. He said they shouldn't be existing anymore. They should have been assimilated into the other religions of the world. But the fact that they had stayed in the Jewish religion really gave testimony to him that maybe there really was a God. Well, the Jewish people are really quite amazing. With the loss of the temple and the homeland, there came some new emphases. We mentioned earlier the three pillars of Judaism. There's first of all the study of the Torah, the law. It became prominent. So the emphasis went from the public temple worship to private study of God's law. The scribe was an expert at the law, and he displaced in importance the priest who had served in the temple. Secondly, there was the rise of the synagogue as the new center of worship. Wherever 10 adult Jewish males could be found, a synagogue could be formed. In fact, we know of synagogues being in at least 150 cities in the Roman Empire. Now, we'll deal with the synagogue in a little more detail in a few minutes. And then there was rabbinism, that is the emergence of the rabbis or the teachers of the law. Now, there are two other aspects that we should mention here in terms of Judaism that came to prominence during this time. There was circumcision and the keeping of the Sabbath. Of course, the Jews had observed these ever since the giving of the law, but they took on special importance during the exile when there was no temple. During the time that the New Testament was written, the boundary markers of Judaism were circumcision, Sabbath keeping, and food laws. This is what separated the Jews from the Greco-Roman society. Or let's say that was the three most obvious things, the thing that stood out to pagans about them: circumcision, Sabbath keeping, and food laws. The question perhaps should be asked here, was Judaism in the first century a legalistic religion? That is, did the Jews believe that they were earning their place into the people of God, into the ability to go to heaven when they died? Now, this has been a point of debate for the last 40 years, ever since E.P. Sanders wrote his book, Paul and Palestinian Judaism, which was published in 1977. Up to that point, Judaism had generally been viewed as a legalistic religion. That is, that people must earn their way to heaven by good works. Sanders said, no, Judaism was a religion of grace and forgiveness. Now, we're going to go into that when we look at the new perspective on Paul. But that is a point of debate today. And we have those who say, no, Judaism was legalistic. Look at the Pharisees. Look at the people that Paul combats there in his letters. And others say, no, look at the rabbinic writings. It shows that Judaism was a religion of forgiveness and grace. All right, questions or comments here?
Sir,
Yes.
I'd like to ask for the word rabbi. It means teachers of the law. Do you think it's still applicable nowadays to call someone as rabbi, or it's only in the context of Jewish community or Jewish religion? Because actually,
Yes.
I heard one of the groups in the Philippines. They have a leader there. In one school, they call their head as a rabbi. I'm not sure is that still appropriate.
Well, rabbi is a Jewish title, and I don't think it's appropriate for a non-Jewish Christian to use the term rabbi. Today, there are rabbis, of course, in Judaism, and there are people who really are dedicated to the concept that Christians should take on Jewish culture, that they ought to obey laws of the Old Testament, they ought to use Jewish terminology, they ought to celebrate the festivals of the Jews, that kind of thing. I think it's important that we know what those are. That's our roots. If we're going to understand the New Testament, we're going to have to understand, at least to a certain extent, Judaism. But there comes a point when I think we can go too far. If we think that we have to become Jews in order to be Christians, the church has already said no. You know, go to Acts 15. Circumcision is not required. And Paul says, if you get yourself circumcised, Christ is of no use to you, you know? So there's a point at which it's too far. And we should appreciate the Jews. We should appreciate the background that they have given us. If it were not for Judaism, we would not understand the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And we have been grafted in to the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, you know, into God's people. So we are the true Jews, Paul says. We are the true children of Abraham. And we can't forget that. But yet we don't take on the Jewish religion as if Christ hadn't come, or as if that is going to make us perfect. Anyway, yeah, I would say that it's not appropriate for a Christian, non-Jewish Christian, to take on the title of rabbi. I mean, that would just seem strange to me. Okay, let us.
And then, sir,
Yes,
yeah,
go
thank
ahead.
you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Now, just thinking about the fivefold ministry in the book of the fivefold ministry, the giftings. It's not in there, Rabbi. The word rabbi is not.
That's right. That's right. Now you may say, well, it's another word for teacher.
Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Hey, let's take a
Thank you, sir.
break.
Thank you, sir.
Let's take a 10-minute break, and we will come back in 10 minutes. Have a good one. Get yourself some coffee. All right, we will look now at the theology of Judaism. We're not going to go into this to any extent. We'll only mention three basic beliefs of Judaism. N.T. Wright says that the entire theological worldview of Judaism of the first century can be summarized in these three beliefs. Okay, do you have monotheism on your screen? Okay. First of all, monotheism. This is the belief in one God. And this is the most basic and important of all Jewish beliefs. Now, this doesn't mean that the Jews worshiped one God among many. It means that there only is one God. There is no other being that we can call God. There are other spiritual beings, but none of them is on the level of God. Every synagogue service began with the Shema, Deuteronomy 6:4-9, which begins, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And many times in Isaiah, God said, "I am the Lord, and there is no other." Next, we have the doctrine of election. And this is the belief that God chose Abraham and his descendants to be his special people. Unfortunately, this was looked at as a privilege rather than a responsibility. Rather than being a light to the Gentiles, they became the enemy of the Gentiles. And then thirdly, eschatology. Eschatology is the belief that God has a plan for this world that he's working out in the present. There is a future for the people of God. And this was unique in the ancient Near East. In other cultures, time was viewed as cyclic in nature. Cycles simply repeated themselves endlessly. Now, of course, eschatology is very important in the New Testament. Jesus came fulfilling the prophecies of the Old Testament. The New Testament is a thoroughly eschatological book. So when we think of eschatology, we shouldn't just think in terms of the second coming, who the Antichrist is, questions about the tribulation, the millennium, that kind of thing. From the very beginning of the New Testament, it is eschatological. We come seeing Jesus. We see Jesus coming to fulfill those prophecies of the Old Testament. Wright summarizes these three Jewish beliefs in this way. There is one creator God who has chosen Israel to be his people, giving her his Torah and establishing her in his holy land. He will act for her and through her to reestablish his judgment and justice, his wisdom and his shalom throughout the world. So this is just a thumbnail sketch of the theology of Judaism. Questions, comments? All right. Let's look at the temple. The Jews had three temples, or perhaps two, depending on how you look at it, in succession. We first of all have Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple was built in 950 BC, in the 11th year of Solomon's reign. Solomon's temple was certainly spectacular. It was destroyed, however, in 586 BC by the Babylonians. It's estimated that if Solomon's temple were built today, it would cost between 150 and 200 billion US dollars. That is a lot of money. It was a spectacular building. One of the greatest buildings ever to be built in the history of the world. But it was destroyed by the Babylonians. we have the Second Temple. The Second Temple was built after the return from exile between the years 537 and 516 BC. We know very little about this temple. Certainly in splendor, it was much inferior to Solomon's temple. The Ark of the Covenant was taken or destroyed in the exile and had disappeared from the pages of history, Indiana Jones notwithstanding. Have any of you seen the movie Raiders of the Lost Ark? Nobody? Okay, well, there it is. It is shown that the ark is in a warehouse in Washington, D.C. But you ought to see that movie just to get, just enculturate a little bit in Western culture. So the Holy of Holies didn't have the Ark of the Covenant in it. This temple stood for almost 500 years, longer than either Solomon's temple or Herod's temple. The Second Temple was never violently destroyed. It was replaced section by section by Herod's temple. Herod the Great began reconstructing the temple in 19 or 20 BC. For a year and a half, the construction of the sanctuary itself went on with the priest being the construction workers. So since the sanctuary was restricted to priests, only they did the construction. The process of construction of the entire temple took many more years. That is why the Jews could say to Jesus, "It has taken 46 years to build the temple. And are you going to raise it in 3 days?" The building must have been a spectacular sight, especially to a person traveling into Jerusalem. It was of white marble, partially covered by gold. By the time Herod had finished the temple, it was the largest religious building in the world. 140,000 square meters. They say that the temple of Diana in Ephesus, of Artemis, was just a magnificent place. But I think probably when Paul went there and saw it, he probably wasn't very impressed, because he had already seen something even more impressive, which was the temple in Jerusalem. Philo, the first century Jew, said, "The buildings of it are of most exceeding beauty and magnificence, so as to be universal objects of admiration to all who behold them, and especially to all foreigners who travel in those parts, and who, comparing them with their own public edifices, marvel both at the beauty and the sumptuousness of this one." Now, here is a visual comparison of Solomon's temple with the temple of Herod. You can see Herod's temple was much larger than Solomon's. The temple was made up of several sections. There was, first of all, the court of the Gentiles. Anyone could go into this part of the temple. This was like the outer court. And then there was the temple proper, and this was restricted to Jews. A sign has been discovered which hung in the temple. And this is the sign. It's in the Israeli Museum. And it says, "No man of another nation to enter within the fence and enclosure round the temple. And whoever is caught will have himself to blame that his death ensues." So you go in there and you're not a Jew, you're going to die. That's what it's saying. We then have the outer court, which is part of the temple proper, also called the women's court. Women could go into this part. On the western side was the court of the Israelites, or the men's court, from which women were excluded. So they couldn't go into that part. Within the court of the Israelites was the court of the priests. And within that was the sanctuary. The sanctuary was made up of the porch, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. The holy place was entered only by the priests and contained the table of showbread and the 7-branch lampstands and the altar of incense. The Holy of Holies was entered once a year by the high priest, and there he made sacrifice for himself and for the people on the Day of Atonement. So, as we mentioned, since the ark had been lost during the time of the Second Temple, or Herod's temple, the Holy of Holies stood empty. Now here is a schematic, a drawing of what the temple looked like. You will see to the far right, there is the women's court. Now outside the women's court, we have the larger courtyard that Gentiles could go into. They could not get into the women's court. That is where the temple proper began. Then within that, if you go to the left, there is the court of the Israelites. This is where the men could go. And then we have the court of the priests, where we have the altar. And then within that, we have the sanctuary, made up of the porch. It says sanctuary here. That's usually called the holy place. And then the Holy of Holies. And let me just say, there is some terminology inconsistency here. Some people call this, all of this dark area here, the sanctuary. So the sanctuary would be made up of the porch, the holy place, and the Holy of Holies. But as you can see in this drawing, the holy place is called the sanctuary. So in this drawing, only that place between the porch and the Holy of Holies is a sanctuary. So as you read about this in the various books, you will notice that they are not consistent. So you have to really keep in mind here what they're talking about and keep it all straight. What did the temple look like? Here is a reconstruction, perhaps, of the temple. And here is another one, the way it would have looked. This area out here to the right-hand side, that courtyard would be the court of the Gentiles. That is probably where Jesus cleansed the temple, turning over the tables of the money changers. This is the way the Temple Mount looks today. We have the Western Wall, or as it's called, the Wailing Wall. And Jews come here to pray. These blocks that you see here were originally part of the retaining wall of the temple. They are not part of the temple itself. So when Jesus said not one stone is going to be kept upon another, he was right. The Romans destroyed the entire temple, but yet we do have part of the retaining wall here. And you can tell from the size of the blocks and all, different layers. And the smaller bricks at the top are from a later time period. This is the southeast corner of the Temple Mount. And if you look at the steps on the far left side there, those were the main entrance into the temple in Jesus' day. It is almost certain that Jesus himself walked up those steps to enter the temple. So if you want to find a place where you can know pretty much for certain where Jesus stood, where Jesus was, that would be one of the places. Now, the coins that were used in the temple were the Tyrian half shekel. And here is a picture of the Tyrian half shekel. You can see the images that are on the half shekel. I find it really ironic that the coins that they used in the temple had something that actually would be offensive to conservative Jews, to have the image like this, but they had it anyway. That's what they did. Now, the reckoning of 3 temples is not universal. Many consider Herod's temple not a 3rd temple, but as an extension of the 2nd temple. In fact, this period up to the destruction of the temple in AD 70 is called Second Temple Judaism. Okay, questions, comments? All right. Let's look at the synagogue. The synagogue became a key element in the preservation of Judaism. It was the social and educational center of Jewish life at the time of Christ. So in the temple, we had ritual sacrifice, but in the synagogue, we had the study of the law. In the temple, the priest was the key person. In the synagogue, the rabbi was the key person. In the temple, there was the communal faith. In the synagogue, the individual life. There was a head of the synagogue, the person who led the worship, and there was also the synagogue attendants, those who worked along with the head of the synagogue. There was a chest that contained the scrolls. You know, they didn't have books, they had scrolls, long pieces of papyrus that were wound around a stick. And they had a chest that was designated for that. There was a platform with a reading desk, there were lamps, and there was seating. In terms of the order of worship, there was the invocation, the inviting God to bless the time of worship. There was the reading of a psalm as a call to worship. There was the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And they had the reading of the 10 Commandments. There was the Barakot, the 18 benedictions. There was the reading of the scriptures and the sermon that would normally be based on that reading, and then a blessing, or if a prayer, if no priest was present. You know, most of the priests did not live in Jerusalem. Most of them lived out in other areas. And remember the parable of the Good Samaritan. The priest comes along, going from Jerusalem to Jericho, which is probably where he lived. There were priests who lived in the various towns and would attend the synagogue. The synagogue had a tremendous influence upon the church. In fact, one scholar has said that Christian worship in its New Testament form was a result of the fusion of the synagogue and the upper room. From the synagogue, they got a basic order of worship. And from the upper room, they got the communion ceremony, the Lord's Supper. And you put those two together and you have something very similar or very influential upon New Testament worship. Let's look at
Excuse
this.
me, doctor.
Yes.
What is communal faith? What does it mean, doctor?
Okay. The communal faith.
Yeah, yes, doctor. Yes.
Okay. It's the faith that stresses the faith of the community. Okay. The stress is on the community, whereas in the synagogue, the stress is on the individual. Okay? So that is what we mean by communal faith. Okay? Okay, the sacred year. The Jews used two calendars simultaneously. They had the civil year and they had the cultic year. The civil year began in October with Rosh Hashanah, and the religious and cultic year began in the spring with Passover. And now the church also operates on two calendars, the church today. The civil calendar begins on January 1st and ends on December 31st. But the church year begins with Advent, 4 Sundays before Christmas. The season of Advent begins. And then it leads up to Christmas Day. And then we have Christmas season or Christmastide, which goes from Christmas Day to Epiphany, which is January 6th. And probably some of you have heard the song, The 12 Days of Christmas. This is what it's referring to, from December 25th to January 6th. And then there's ordinary time, or called the time after Epiphany, which goes from January 6th to Ash Wednesday. On Ash Wednesday, the Roman Catholics put ashes on their forehead, which begins the season of Lent, which goes up then to the evening before Easter. So during the time of Lent, many people give up something during that time. Like they'll give up television or give up the internet or give up eating meat or something like that during that time. There is then the Easter season, which goes from Easter to Pentecost. And then what we call ordinary time, which goes from Pentecost, which is normally in May, all the way to Advent, 4 Sundays before Christmas. So we in the church have a civil and a religious calendar. Throughout the year, there were 7 major festivals or feasts. For 3 of these, all male Jews were to be in Jerusalem for Passover, for Pentecost, and for the Feast of Tabernacles. Let's just look at each one of them briefly. Passover. This was the celebration of the Israelites' deliverance from Egypt. It was the most important of all Jewish feasts. Our Easter falls in Passover season. Pentecost, or the Feast of Weeks. Pentecost gets its name because it takes place 50 days after Passover, Penteconta. It marked the completion of the barley harvest, and at times is called the Feast of Harvest or the Day of First Fruits. It was a time of joy and thanksgiving for God's blessings. In intertestamental times, it came to be associated with the giving of the law on Sinai. The Feast of Trumpets, or the New Year, Rosh Hashanah. This was the Jewish civil year, a time of general rejoicing. The Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. The Day of Atonement came 9 days after Rosh Hashanah. It was a holy, solemn day, the only day of the year that the high priest entered the Holy of Holies and offered sacrifices for the people. It was also the day that the scapegoat, or the Azazel, as it was called, was driven into the desert, symbolically carrying away the people's sins. There was the Feast of Tabernacles, Sukkot, also called the Feast of Booths or the Festival of Ingathering. This feast served as a reminder of the Jews sojourning in the wilderness. At the feast, they lived in booths or huts made of the boughs of trees and palm branches. It also celebrated the close of harvest. And then there is the Feast of Lights, or Hanukkah, also called the Feast of Dedication. Of the 7 feasts, this is the only one that is intertestamental in origin. It was established in 164 BC when Judas Maccabeus recaptured and cleansed the temple after it had been defiled by Antiochus Epiphanes. It is celebrated at about the time of Christmas. Jesus celebrated this festival as recorded in John 10:32. So Jesus celebrated Hanukkah. In any of your countries, is Hanukkah celebrated? No? Probably because there isn't a large Jewish community there. But where the Jews live, they celebrate Hanukkah. In America, we have 3 celebrations in December. We have Christmas for the Christians, we have Hanukkah for the Jews, and we have Kwanzaa for the African Americans, the Black people there in America. And then finally, we have the Feast of Purim. The origin of this feast is recorded in Esther chapter 9. It comes from the word meaning lots, and it was a national holiday on which the book of Esther was read. So these are the feasts of the Jewish religion. Again, let me open it up for questions or comments. All right. One thing that we need to be aware of is this idea of purity. To approach a holy God, one has to be holy and ritually clean. Every society has its standards of purity, and they differ from society to society. That's one thing that makes it so interesting living on an international campus like APTS, because you have people coming from 30 different cultures, living together, and they all have different standards of purity. You know, when I grew up, there were certain times we would always wash our hands. You know, we would always wash our hands after we went to the bathroom. We would, as much as possible, we would wash our hands before we ate. And that was just drilled into me. This is something that you do. Not everybody has those standards. And I'm sure that you're aware of that. Many cultures have their standards of cleanliness. How often do you take a shower? Now, the Filipinos are very good about taking showers. You know, they're always neat, and it's really quite wonderful. People from some other cultures do not quite have that standard. In fact, you can tell when they come into the room, even without seeing them, because you can smell them when they come in. And it's really interesting. I think most of them, by the time they graduate, you know, they have learned to adapt. But we all have our standards, you know, and COVID has really made a difference, I think, for a lot of people. You know, to wash your hands often for your own safety so that you won't die. Wash your hands, wear that mask, you know, do that kind of thing. Not only cleanliness, but what kind of food is acceptable? We have differences there. What kind of dress is acceptable? I heard of a missionary who was in Japan on a Sunday, and there the women wore their neckline was up around their neck like that, but their skirts were split up to their hips. The next Sunday he was in Africa, where their skirts went all the way to the floor, but the neckline was the waist, you know? And if you take them from one society to another, you take the person from Japan to Africa, or the person from Africa to Japan, and it's going to be very offensive, even though in its own culture, it's very much normal. We're going to look at this for the Jews because they had standards of purity. Now, the Jews didn't distinguish between ritual and moral law. The same sacrifices applied to both ritual and moral offenses. For the Jews, some things were holy and some things were common or profane. To approach a holy God, a person had to be ceremonially clean. Some things were clean and some unclean. The unclean could not come into God's presence. When you read Leviticus, you read all kinds of regulations of purity. There were clean and unclean foods. Excuse me. Eating food that had not been properly prepared, that were not kosher, would make you unclean. Bodily discharges, that is, liquids that come out of the body, could cause you to be unclean. Touching a dead body or contracting leprosy could make you unclean. Touching a person who had touched a dead body could make you unclean. Eating with a Gentile or entering a Gentile's home could make you unclean. Now imagine it as spiritual COVID. Okay, spiritual COVID. It can be transmitted from an unclean to a clean person. So lepers, since they were unclean, stayed apart from other people. The Pharisees of the first century applied the purity rituals for priests to everyone. So no longer was it just for priests. For the Pharisees, they said it should be applied to everyone. Wright and Bird say, for them, all of life had to be lived as if one were in the temple in the very presence of God. In New Testament times, an important ritual for purity was taking a ritual bath. Wherever archaeologists have found Jewish homes from the first century, they have found these ritual baths called mikvaot, or mikveh is the singular, outside the temple, there are many mikvaot. And here is a picture of one, a mikveh. This is right outside the temple. So before a person went into the temple, they would go down into the mikvaot, do a ritual cleansing, and then come out. And there were mikvaot for men in one place and women in another. And there were many of these. And it was believed that while ceramic and wooden vessels could become contaminated, stone vessels couldn't. So stone vessels were the preferred kind of vessels for the Jews to use. In John 2, we are told of Jesus turning the water into wine. And in verse 6, we are told specifically that these were jars, that the jars used were stone jars. The jars probably looked very much like these first century stone jars. Now, this stone here was very soft, and you could put it on a lathe, turn it on a lathe, and it would be round. The stone is actually, by some people, called chalk, although it was more solid than what we would normally think of as chalk. It was soft limestone. We read in the New Testament about the Pharisees demanding that people wash their hands before they eat. And they accuse the disciples of not doing this. The disciples evidently didn't do that. They were out in the fields. They were taking the grains and using them to eat. Now, it wasn't that the Pharisees were concerned about the transmission of disease. It was rather a religious concern. And Mark gives the explanation in Mark 7:3-4. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of the elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. Now, remember, this is not for cleanliness. It is not for so they won't get a disease. This is in order to be religiously, ceremonially clean. Okay, so this is religious. It's not simply physical. Notice that when the leper asked Jesus to heal him, he doesn't say, "Heal me." He says, "Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean." And Jesus doesn't say, "Be healed." He says, "Be clean." And he was healed, and he was made clean. So two things are going on. Not only is he healed, that's wonderful in itself, but now he is ceremonially clean. No longer does he have leprosy. No longer does he have to separate himself from society. Jesus redefined purity. His disciples didn't always wash their hands, at least not according to the way the Pharisees wanted them to. Jesus said he was Lord of the Sabbath. He called the temple, the most holy place of the Jews, a den of robbers. And Jesus wasn't afraid of becoming defiled. You see, to touch a person with leprosy means that you become defiled. But Jesus touched people with leprosy and he didn't become defiled. Rather, they were made clean. When the woman with the issue of blood touched Jesus, normally he would have become unclean, but he didn't. Rather, she became healed and clean. When Jesus touched the young man who had died, He normally would have been unclean, but he wasn't. Rather, the young man came to life. In the Old Testament, the unclean makes the clean unclean. In the New Testament, the clean makes the unclean clean. It is like cleanliness is contagious. Even in a marriage, Paul said that the believer being married to the unbeliever would make the unbeliever clean. Not that he's saved, but he's under the influence of the gospel. For the Christian, purity is more internal than external. But internal purity will show itself in holiness of life. Okay? We will stop here. Our time is up. Do you have any questions or comments before we stop? All right. If there are none, we will stop here and we will take up here next time. God bless you, and we will see you then.
Thank you so much,
Sure.
Doctor.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah.
Yes,
Thank
goodbye,
you,
sir.
everyone.
Bye-bye.